Figure 6.21, default arguments to a function. In C++, you have the ability of defining multiple functions that have the exact same name. This is a concept called overloaded functions, which we'll actually be looking at in a subsequent example in this lesson. You also have the ability to specify default argument values for each of the parameters in a method. So in this particular example, we're going to have a function called box volume that calculates the length times the width times the height of a box and returns that volume. Now, you can see here that we've specified each of the parameters with its name and a value to the right of the equal sign. This is indicating that the default value for the length, if the user does not provide the length, is going to be 1. The default value for the width is also going to be 1, and the default value for the height is also going to be 1. Now, if you want to use default arguments, they must be the last for the last parameters in the parameter list. In this case, all 3 parameters have a default value. If any given parameter has a default value, all of the parameters to its right must also have default values in order for the compiler to compile the code properly. Now, once we specify default values for the parameters, we can actually call this function several different ways. We can call it with no arguments, in which case what the compiler does first is it looks for a version of the box volume function that takes no arguments. It doesn't find one, but it sees that there's a box volume function that takes 3 integers, all of which have default values of 1. So this box volume call with empty parentheses is the equivalent of me typing 1, 1, 1 as the arguments to the box volume function. Let me get rid of those, go back to the way it was. Now, we can also call it with a single argument. In this case, what's going to happen is, again, it's going to look for a box volume function that receives 1 integer. It knows to look for int because 10 is a whole number int value. And if it can't find such a function, it's going to look for a function that can be called with that 1 integer plus some default arguments. And it finds, once again, box volume, where 10 is going to become the value of the length parameter, and then the width and the height will each be 1 respectively. In this case down here, we're showing you that we can also call this function with 2 arguments. The first one would represent the length, the second one would represent the width, and the last one will be implicitly given the value 1 as the height. And then finally, we can of course call it with 3 arguments, that will become the length, the width, and the height respectively. So if we go ahead and look at the definition of box volume, you can see that it receives length, width, and height and just returns the product of those 3 values multiplied together. And notice, by the way, that the default values were specified in the function prototype, not in the function definition. And the reason for that is normally function prototypes are placed into header files, and those header files get included wherever you intend to use the function. And that's important because the source code that's going to call box volume, the so-called client code of the box volume function, needs to know what those default values are. And it also needs to know how to call the function. And those are both things that you typically specify with a function prototype. So if we were developing a more robust system, we might put the box volume prototype into a header file. We might put the box volume function definition into a .cpp file, and then compile those together with some client code like the main function here that's going to be using the box volume function. Let's just run this program so that you can see the results of calling box volume the different ways. The default box volume is 1. That's where we called box volume with no arguments. The volume of a box with length 10, width 1, and height 1, where we pass just 10 into the function, is 10, and width and height were defaulted to 1. Next, we passed 10 and 5 into the function and got a default height of 1 for a box volume of 50. And then for the last one, we passed in 10, 5, and 2 explicit values for each of the parameters.